Hello and welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World. I have a feeling this is going to be a very popular episode because today we're talking about pooping, because not enough people talk about it and everyone's really, really worried about it. So I have appealed to the director, the chief of Gastroenterology from Princeton Medical Center. He's also the co-director for the Center for Digestive Health at the same institution. He is the GERD program director at Princeton Medical Center, a Princeton man, you say, and a clinical assistant professor of medicine at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, which is a far more successful organization than the New York Jets. Dr. Anish Sheth, welcome to Kennedy Saves the World.
Thanks. It's great to be here. And I actually went to Brown University. You can't make this up.
Stop it. You're a poop doctor who went to Brown.
That's correct. Brown Medical School is what it is called and was
sure
called
is.
when I was there. Yes.
Well, that's exciting. I think that people don't talk about it enough, and there's so much anxiety around pooping. Why is that? Because I think anxiety makes it worse. I'm just going to say it.
It does. Anxiety makes everything worse. But look, I think this is actually something we should care about, which is why anxiety, I'm not saying it's okay, but we don't feel good when we don't have good bowel habits. And I think people realize that, right? People get anxious because you have to, do a podcast, or you have to go to work, or you have to get on a flight. And if the bowels aren't working or they're working too much, that causes anxiety. It's an important part of our bodily function. So I get it.
So let's start with what is normal. How often should people be pooping?
Yeah, so this is the range, and people sometimes look at me weird when I say this, but 3 times a day, all the way down to once every 3 days. That is the range of what's considered normal.
That is a nice, wide...
It's wide, right? We want to be inclusive.
Range.
We don't want to shame anybody. But the point is, everyone has their baseline and has their routine. And if you're feeling good, you're eating well, your belly doesn't hurt, you're not bloated, and you're anywhere in that spectrum, you're good to go, right? So the issue is when you start having changes where you used to go every day, now you're going every 3rd day. That may not be normal for you.
What happens? What creates those changes?
Yeah, so life happens, right? So diet changes, our hydration changes, our exercise activity. If we travel, we get jet lagged, our circadian rhythms, our biological clocks. Sometimes women around their menstrual cycle will either get constipated or get diarrhea. So that's the other thing, and why people are anxious about this is because we feel like we should be able to control this, right? Like we are creatures of habit, and people wonder, and they come into my office and they say, look, I eat the same thing every day, I exercise the same, I do this. How come one day I can have a perfect, great bowel movement, and the next day I'm locked up? And that's sort of one of the frustrations.
Confetti.
Yes, exactly. So that's the frustration, and that's why I guess I have a job, and why people buy the book. But I think it is frustrating, and even as a gastroenterologist, sometimes it sort of defies explanation as to why somebody can have the best bowel movement followed by a week where they're having diarrhea, for instance.
Well, I have celiac disease, and celiac, as far as I know, from everything I've been told by my celiac doctor to my just garden variety gastroenterologist, is a hereditary condition. It's a genetic condition. And I've had a bad stomach my whole life. And even when I was a kid, I had a bad stomach. And of course, when you're a kid, you don't want to talk about poop with your doctor. It's the worst thing in the world. But maybe if I had had a more honest conversation, I would have been diagnosed sooner. I wasn't diagnosed until my mid-30s.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, specifically with celiac. But, with anything, whether it's celiac or irritable bowel, there's just a lot of hesitation in terms of especially young people, especially we see it in young women. I think the last study I read said that the average young woman with irritable bowel syndrome tries to treat and manage her symptoms for 3.5 years.
I believe that.
Before she seeks medical attention, right?
And
I think...
Yeah, go ahead. No, please finish that.
No, and I think it's just unfortunate, right? Because people are unnecessarily suffering, and there's hopefully, podcasts like this, conversations like this, I think we've come a long way in terms of being able to discuss this, but there are some people culturally and otherwise who just don't feel like this is something they can talk about, and unfortunately they suffer, and as in your case, they sometimes don't get diagnosed with things, while they're young.
Well, then I developed microscopic colitis. And that was about as much fun as I don't know, juggling chainsaws with a blindfold on. That was not the greatest era of my life, and right now I'm in remission, which is fantastic. But also,
That's great.
the good thing about that is I have no shame, I have no fear. I am not grossed out when people talk about their bowel issues and not being able to poop and pooping too much, and people get really, really worried. And so, to your point, what happens when you get anxiety? Why is it that anxiety, because I really have a feeling that people who tend to be more sensitive and anxious, they have more bowel issues, but there has to be a physiological correlation.
Yeah.
It cannot just be, well, you're nervous, Nelly. It's all in your brain.
No, it's
What is the
definitely not.
connection between anxiety and your bowels?
Okay, that's like a great question. I'm going to nerd out for 1 second.
Please
So
do.
there's
Nerd away.
for your listeners, there is the new term for this is it's DBGI. That's the acronym. It's disorders of brain gut interaction. It's exactly what you're describing. And yes, if you went to a physician, a gastroenterologist 30 years ago, they would tell a young woman walking into their office, it's all in your head, you're anxious, relax. Sometimes they would even give them what we used to call tranquilizers, sedatives to just relax. So what we know now is that it's a two-way street and it's a vicious cycle, right? So basically what happens is you get GI symptoms, which creates by itself an anxiety, right? Because we are in public places and we have to function in
Oh,
society,
is there
right?
anything worse than having to go and the
Yeah.
fear of not having a bathroom?
I have patients who will not travel or take tours because they need to know where the bathroom is and they're worried about it, right? And there are things that we can do to help. But basically, it becomes a cycle because that creates anxiety. And when you're anxious, your brain is sending signals to your gut via neurotransmitters and nerve endings saying something's wrong, even though nothing could be wrong. And that revs up the intestines. It makes them move things downstream more quickly. It causes more fluid to be secreted into the intestines. It causes the nerve endings to become more sensitive to things like gas and cramping and muscle spasms. And what does that do? That makes you feel worse and makes you more anxious, and then the cycle goes on and on and on. So when we treat patients with these conditions, we have to focus on the gut, and we can talk about it, probiotics, etc. But we also talk about things like cognitive behavioral therapy and acupuncture and meditation and yoga, because you really have to treat both the brain and the gut.
I agree. I mean, I've been a fan of meditation for years to try and calm down my anxiety. So, it was really no surprise to me when I found that there was this physiological correlation between the gut and, people who are anxious. There is a predisposition to that. And it's not necessarily your fault. It's not necessarily
not.
your environment. So why did we evolve to have so
Yeah.
many neurons in our
Yeah.
guts?
Yes,
And why
yes.
did the body evolve to evacuate the bowels when it's nervous?
So this gets into like the stress response, right? And this is also the reason for a lot of other medical conditions, which is basically, and this is the sort of the tale, right? When we were living on the plains and our major threats to survival were lions and tigers and things, we had to have a physiology and a body that kicked into gear to preserve ourselves, right? To survive. And so all the things that happened to us then that were survival advantages now are still present in our body, but are being triggered not by a lion chasing us down the street, but by the presentation or meeting our in-laws or travel or whatever the source of anxiety is. And those same hormones, cortisol, epinephrine, nerve endings, all the stuff that was released to enhance our survival, that's why we're here now, is now not an adaptive trait. It basically causes a lot of these things. It causes anxiety and irritable bowel syndrome and diarrhea. It can cause migraines, a whole host of medical issues, right? So that's sort of where we are right now. It's sort of we have survived, but now some of these things are really being triggered when they shouldn't be triggered. And that's where, other professionals like mental health professionals and psychologists, and you mentioned yoga and all these things that we're now trying to incorporate into our lives to just make it through the day are important.
Yeah, because it's like I realized that I was almost holding my breath, and it's like I was holding my stomach, and then I think it was just and as a stress and anxiety response, and I think it was exacerbating everything that was going on in my guts. But oh, go ahead. No, I want you to
Yeah, no,
address.
so for sure. So I'm glad you talked about the nerve endings, right? Because we have, so people know serotonin as a mood neurotransmitter, right? It's what we take medicines for when we're depressed or anxious, right? But there is just as much serotonin in the GI tract as there is in our brain. That's one interesting fact. The second thing is we have also evolved with trillions of active gut bacteria, right? And we're just scratching the surface as to what they're doing and why they're there and what role they play. We actually have more bacteria in our gut than we do cells in our entire body. So they must
Wow.
be doing something. And we do know that from a gut perspective, right? When you take antibiotics and your gut doesn't feel good, like that's an example. But there's so much going into gut effects on mental health, right? So some of your questions today about the role of anxiety and gut issues, it may come down to the fact that the gut microbiome or the balance of gut bacteria is off. And that's not just contributing to gut issues, but that actually may be directly causing anxiety and mental health issues. So that's the other
Wow.
potential link between the brain and the gut. And that's why people are taking probiotics, but we're
I've
just at the very
never heard
beginning.
it. I've never heard the train going that way. I've
Yeah,
always heard it going from the top down. I've never heard that an
yeah.
imbalance could be exacerbating, a predisposition for anxiety. That is absolutely fascinating. Don't go anywhere. More Kennedy Saves the World right after this. What can people do about it? Because I know there are all sorts of tests you can do. And
Yes.
it's like, I'm like a lot of people. I don't want to be on any more drugs.
Yes.
I already take, 2 drugs for my gut. I don't want to take anything more. I don't mind taking supplements. I don't mind changing my diet. I've already done that. I mean, I'm obviously gluten free, but how do you diagnose that? And how do you
Yeah.
trust it? And then what do you do to treat an imbalance like that?
Yeah, so I think the key thing here is everyone's different. So a lot of folks will speak about these topics and they'll just say, yeah, eat fiber and eat healthy and drink water and avoid sugar and avoid fatty foods and all and processed foods. Like we all know that, right? And I think those are important, right? Ultra processed foods is in the news every day now. And it's appropriate that we decrease the amount of ultra processed foods, right? But there is so much more, and everyone is different, right? So part of a gastroenterologist's job is to understand what an individual person's triggers are, right?
Hmm.
I have women who just have gut issues the week before they have their menstrual cycle, right? So I'm going to manage that differently than somebody who has daily symptoms or anxiety related symptoms. Diet is important, mental health is important, sleeping is important. There's a big link between people who don't sleep well, again, which could be related to anxiety
Hmm.
also, but maybe its own issue, and gut issues. So things like irritable bowel syndrome, even things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel diseases are related to that. So part of it is like looking at the entire patient, figuring out what their specific things are. But yes, you want to sleep well, you want to exercise, drink water, decrease ultra processed foods. There are certain probiotics out there that have been studied. 98, 99% of the probiotics that are in the stores,
Or
we don't
dead?
know anything about them. So there are a few good ones. I don't know if you want me to talk about brand names. I'm happy
Sure. No,
to.
go for it. Like,
Yeah,
I
the
want
two
people
that
to
we
be able to take
recommend
away something.
is Align, so
Hmm.
Align, Align, and Culturel are the two best studied, widely available probiotics. So if you just have general gut health, issues, or you want to be healthy, those two are great. A great place to start with one of those two. And then I think everything else depends on kind of what your issues are, what your triggers are. But we have actually embedded in our office now cognitive behavioral therapists, because I think this is one of those things, like you said, people don't want to say, oh, here, take this anxiety medicine, take this depression medicine. They want to understand their disease, they want to understand ways to manage it. And so cognitive behavioral therapy has been amazing for our patients and patients all over, because if you can access it, it really helps you to put your symptoms into context. The therapist will give you tools and techniques to help manage those symptoms. And what we find over months is the impact that those symptoms have on the person's life dramatically decrease, right? So they say, yes, I used to feel bloated and I had to just shut down and go home from work early because it was just devastating.
If that were the
And you
case, I
see,
never would have worked a day in my life.
yeah, But over the course of months, with the proper teaching and techniques, these symptoms get better, they get managed, the signaling gets better, the management techniques get better, and we can get these conditions to a place where they really don't impact people's
I know, but
quality of life.
I love that you're talking about getting back to the basics, because those are some of the things that we're so hesitant to try. You know, it's like
Yeah.
good sleep, hydration, meditation, externalizing your worries, the things that I learned in dialectical behavioral therapy that really, you know, in a
Yeah.
sense saved me. And
Yeah, and
I
they don't
always,
work right away, Ken. That's the
no,
issue. That they don't work right away, and so that's the frustrating thing. Is physicians and patients, like, we all want the same thing. We want people to get better quickly, but in a sustained way. What you just said is the way, and it may not work in a day or a week, but over the course of months, these changes in behavior and lifestyle and diet and mental health and cognitive thinking and approach to symptoms, behavioral things, they do work. We know from studies they work, but it's not a quick fix.
that gives me so much hope that in your profession, there is now a comprehensive, a truly comprehensive approach, because, you know, for a lot of people, it's frustrating because you go to your OB and you're like, yeah, you know, my gut feels horrible uh, when I'm about to have my period. And they're like, oh, well, I'm not a gut doctor. And then you go to your gastroenterologist and you're like, you know, there's some hormonal element. They're like, I don't say hormone. Um, but you know, it's like but it's nice to see there's a comprehensive approach. And
Has to be, yeah,
what
for
I've
sure.
always noticed, and I'm curious your opinion on this, is really smart babies usually have colic. And I feel like it's because their guts are, that's where all of their feeling is. And they're so overwhelmed by the end of the day that, you know, it's like I see a lot of frustrated parents with young babies because I feel like they're so smart, they're taking in so much, and they're just overwhelmed. They're just overstimulated, and new parents especially, they don't know what to do. But it always seems like when you put a baby on their tummy with a lot of pressure kind of facing out, it calms everything down.
Yeah, colic has been around for a long time, and we're still trying to figure it out. But yeah, those are interesting theories. And look, we just talked about the gut microbiome, and we talked about the serotonin and the nerve endings. And look, when you're a baby, those things are developing and growing, and the bacteria are multiplying, and the nerve endings are growing. Like, it's not, you know, you don't have to think. It's an active organ. It's an active organ system, and it
Yeah.
just kind of makes sense that it can be a source of discomfort unfortunately, for some babies and their parents.
Do you want to hear something weird?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to reveal something to you that I've never revealed in my
my
broadcast history. I grew Yersinia on a stool culture.
It's very. It's not that. It's not super uncommon. Do you know how you got it? Or
No
were you
idea.
traveling or?
No idea.
No idea.
No
Wow.
idea.
Yeah. So for your listeners, our Yersinia is, everyone knows about E. coli and Salmonella. We all
I
hear
had E.
about these
coli
things.
twice, and I had sapovirus because of Julie Banderas' Thanksgiving party. And 45
boy,
out of 50
Julie.
people got it.
Wow, that's an outbreak. Yeah. So, but yes, Yersinia is another one, but it's just it's a less common bacteria in this country. But most of these things that you're going to grow out of your stool, hopefully not too often, usually related to contaminated food, water. So it ends up being less common in this country than in some other places. But look, we've been listening to the news. There's outbreaks, it seems like, every other month from contaminated produce and things. So we do have to be careful.
Would you discourage people from going on cruise ships because of all the microbes that they contract?
Yeah, so the big cruise ship is the norovirus. And norovirus is one of the most contagious gut infections you can ever get. And so that's why once it gets to a certain point on a cruise ship, they just shut the cruise down and everyone's just got to quarantine and just get off, because once the water source is contaminated, it's just going to spread. So the answer is no. I think unfortunately, even with the best hygiene, you wash your hands. Once the water supply on a cruise ship gets contaminated, there's like nothing you can do. You just have to, because you have to drink water, and like, what are you going to do, right? I guess you could. Well, let me take that back. Maybe you just drink beer and soda the whole cruise, and maybe you'll be fine. But assuming you have to drink water, there's really nothing you can do. And you have so many people eating in the same place, meal after meal, the food prep.
Touching
Yes,
the
it just
shrimp
takes-
and putting it back, and
Yeah, but no, I think cruises are great. I think they're fun, but you have to be careful. But are you any more, I mean, look, you can go to our fast food restaurants in this country and order something and get E. coli. So I think you're not really safe anywhere, and you got to live your life.
All right. So if there's 3 things you want people to take away from this conversation, what are they? Just go ahead and start talking about poop.
Number one, for people that are suffering from gut issues, don't suffer alone. See your doctor. If you're not happy, see another doctor who does have kind of a broad approach to this gut-brain interaction, because there are things we can do to help you. That's number one. Number two, not everyone with gut issues is the same. So if someone's, again, diet can play a role, but I think diet, it sounds crazy to say, but I feel like we are overemphasizing the role. Again, your situation notwithstanding, obviously if you have celiac, it's a dietary intervention to fix it. But irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, diet plays a role, but it's not the end all. So you want to look outside the box, think about your symptoms, talk to somebody who's going to dive in deeply. And the third thing, which is our tagline for the book we wrote, is look before you flush, right? So this is also something that you alluded to early, which is people don't want to talk about their bowel movements. They don't want to look at them. So I know so many people who just have bowel movements, they flush it, and they're like, I don't know what it looks like. Is there blood in your stool? I have no idea.
Freudian.
You got to look before you flush, because sometimes you're going to be the first one to pick up on something. It's going to start subtly. There's going to be a change in the consistency or color of your stool, and identifying that is going to help you to get diagnosed
What's the most worrisome color?
Bright red blood is the worst. Yeah. But again, it's also it's interesting, right? This is the way life and the human body works, right? Bright red blood is more commonly going to be associated with something like hemorrhoids, which are not serious, than they are colon cancer. But that's sometimes how colon cancer also presents. And this speaks to the pattern, which is like if you're seeing a little bit of blood on the toilet paper, you have a hard stool, it's just coming and going, it's probably not anything, and you've gotten checked out before you know you have hemorrhoids. But if you're somebody who's never seen blood and you see bright red blood, that's something you want to identify and then see your doctor so you get appropriate colon cancer screening.
Amen. And catch it early. I have so many friends who are terrified to get their first colonoscopy, and I'm like, it is just, don't die of embarrassment. Everyone there at the colonoscopy center, that's all they do all day long. That would be true. Like people who work at a golf course being embarrassed by seeing you in a pair of spikes.
I haven't heard that one. I like that, though. But you're right. There's nothing to be embarrassed about.
No.
Everyone should know, all your listeners, we start screening age 45. Used to be 50, changed a couple years ago. So if you're 45 and older, get checked. And that's because colon cancer is hitting folks younger and younger, unfortunately.
If you bought Appetite for Destruction when it first came out, go get a colonoscopy. That's what he's saying. All right, Dr. Sheth, thank you so much for your expertise. Look before you flush. You are phenomenal. Continued success, and thank you for saving lives and saving the world.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This has been Kennedy Saves the World. I'm Kennedy.
Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.
Oh, go ahead and leave me a review while you're there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been listening to Kennedy Saves the World on the Fox News Podcast Network.